Welcome to the Saugus Iron Works National Historic Site. It started operation in 1646. It went out of business for the last time in 1670. They tore the dams down and the buildings fell down in disrepair. Over the next 200 years, a succession of other businesses used the Saugus River for water power. In the 19th century, it was woolen mills. There are 3 brick mill buildings that are left over from the Prankers Woolen Manufacturing Company. You see the beige building with the green shutters? That's what's left of the A.A. Scott Woolen Manufacturing Company. They used to have a whole complex of buildings over there. That's the only one that's left now. In 1910, the last mill owner dies. The A.A. Scott Company goes out of business. They start selling off the property. There's a gentleman named William Sumner Appleton, who's one of the founders and the first president of the Society for Preservation of New England Antiquities, sometimes called SPNAA. It's formed in Boston in 1910 with the express purpose of buying up historic properties to preserve them. This house comes on the market. Everybody knows it's a 17th century house, but they think it's the ironmaster's house. We now know from dendrochronology dating the beams in there, this house was built sometime between 1687 and 1690. 20 years after the ironworks was out of business. The A.A. Scott Company owned this house. They had converted into mill tenement. There were 4 families of mill workers living in the house. It had been completely redone in the 1800s. It didn't have the facade gables on the front. It didn't have the porch on the front. It had a 2-story lean-to on the back. It had a big Victorian porch on the front. Appleton and his preservation buddies knew that there was a 17th century house hiding in there. He came and looked at the house with the intention of possibly buying it. It was one of the first purchases of the SPNAA. The other side of the town is the Scott's Boardman house. They thought that it was built in the 1640s and that it housed mill workers. We now know it was built 20 years after the ironworks went out of business. SPNAA ended up buying the Boardman house. They don't buy this house. But Appleton is still concerned that it's a 17th century house and that it be preserved. They look around for a private buyer of the house. In 1915, they run into a gentleman from Framingham named Wallace Nutting, who's an avid collector of antique furniture and runs some photography studios. He's a retired congregational minister. In 1915, he comes and looks at the house, falls in love with it, and decides to buy it and restore it to its original configuration and use it as a showroom for his photography studio. He completely remodels the house to what he thinks its original appearance was, which is what it looks like now. He went one step farther. He bought that mill building and started a business making reproduction colonial furniture. This is the beginning of the colonial revival movement in New England. He fills the house full of antique furniture from his collection. He poses models dressed in phony colonial costumes in it, takes their pictures, and then on the top 2 floors of that mill building, he employs 60 or 70 young women to hand color these black and white pictures, which he then sells. He hires a blacksmith named Edward Guy to make reproduction colonial hardware. He also buys an abandoned brewery building in Newburyport, brings it down, assembles it next to the house, and converts it into a blacksmith studio for Edward Guy to work in. In October of 1941, the Alumni Association of the Henry Ford Trade School in Dearborn, Michigan buys the house. Not the property, just the house, with the intention of disassembling it, moving it to Greenfield Village, and presenting it to Henry Ford as an 80th birthday present. This real estate transaction comes to the attention of a woman who works in the town clerk's office named Louise Hawks. Louise Hawks happens to be the president of the Saugus Historical Society and also the president of the local chapter of the DAR. She has been trying to negotiate since 1930. This is 1941 now, so for 11 years she's been trying to negotiate with Rosenberg to buy the house for the town. They can't agree on a price, but Rosenberg promises her that he won't sell the house to anybody except the DAR or the town. And then he sells it to Henry Ford's trade school. So Louise Hawks melts down, and she gets in touch with Henry Ford. He's afraid of a public relations disaster. He tells her that if she can reimburse the Alumni Association for what they paid for the house, they can keep it in Saugus. In 1943, a group of preservationists led by William Sumner Appleton again meet in Boston at Spinea's headquarters. They form a nonprofit educational corporation called the First Ironworks Association to fundraise for the ironworks. They hook up with a bunch of people who raise enough money that they can reimburse the trade school. They purchase the house. They decide they've got to fundraise to maintain the house. One of the people that's on the board of directors is a woman named Louise DuPont Crowninshield. She's one of the founders of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. She comes from an extremely wealthy, well-connected family. She puts them in touch with a gentleman named Quincy Bent. Quincy Bent is a retired vice president from the Bethlehem Steel Corporation who has a summer home in Beverly. In 1947, he comes to look at the house. He's not very impressed with the house, but he notices the slag pile. There's a big mound of dirt over there, which he recognizes, since he comes from the steel and iron industry, is a slag pile. Slag is the waste from a furnace. Quincy Bent knows that if you have a slag pile, there had to have been a furnace next to it. He gets all excited about trying to find the furnace. This is 1947. At this point in time, William Sumner Appleton has retired. A gentleman named Sager Atwill, who's the president of the Lynn Historic Society, is now the president of the First Ironworks Association. He goes to Concord and hears a slide lecture given by a gentleman named Roland Robbins about finding Thoreau's cabin on Walden Pond. He's very impressed with Roland Robbins. He hires him in the fall of 1948 to do some exploratory archaeology. Roland Robbins is not an archaeologist. He's a house painter. He happens to be a big fan of Thoreau, and he's a member of the Thoreau Society. In 1945, there's the 100th anniversary of Thoreau building a cabin on Walden Pond. It only existed for 2 years. Thoreau built the cabin, lived there for 2 years, then he moved away, and Emerson, who owned the property, tore the cabin down. He gets embroiled in a controversy about where the actual cabin used to be. There's a plaque there, but he's not sure that the plaque is where the cabin was. So he gets permission from the property owner to excavate. He discovers the foundation of Thoreau's cabin. He becomes an instant overnight celebrity. Here's one of his slide lectures and decides he'd be the perfect person to excavate the furnace. In September of 1948, Roland Robbins comes and digs 4 test pits and immediately finds the foundation for the furnace. He's hired for another 5 weeks to do more archaeology. His appointment actually turns out to be 5 years long. He finds the foundation for the blast furnace, about a third of the blast furnace water wheel, the frame for the bellows, the foundation for the forge, the trip hammer, the rolling and slitting mill, the dock, the bulkhead, the warehouse. He finds all this stuff and he digs it all up. It is now in storage in our archives or in display on our museum. He finds an enormous amount of material left over from the original ironworks. He also finds thousands of Native American stone tools. The site had been occupied by Native Americans for 8,000 years. There were thousands of tools. After they discover all this material and take it all away, they decide to do what's typical for that period in terms of restoration. They decide to rebuild the buildings of the ironworks. They rebuild the furnace, they rebuild the forge, and they rebuild the rolling and slitting mill. So those are all replicas. There's nothing original in that site except for the slag pile. Everything else is a replica. It opens as a private museum on September 17th, 1954, with an admission charge of 25 cents. It's very successful. It has great visitation for the first couple of years. The problem is keeping it maintained. They look really nice, they look really complete, but you don't get to see all the arguments that went on behind the scenes when they were building these replicas. For example, one of the problems you run into is you may not have enough information to tell you about a particular object, so you have to guess your way through that object. So for example, the rolling and slitting mill, when they built Bridge Street, they bulldozed the area where the rolling and slitting mill is. All they found were little pieces of the building. That's a highly speculative reconstruction. The American Iron and Steel Institute had really deep pockets. This is right after the Second World War, so you can imagine how big the American iron and steel industry was in 1947 and 1948. They spent $2.35 million doing the restoration and archaeology work here. That's the equivalent of $26 million today. That's a brief introduction to the history of the preservation of this site.